In the fall of 2016, law enforcement in the Bronx borough of New York City arrested a woman who'd been accused of stealing $100 from a wheelchair-bound elderly grandmother. As shown by surveillance footage, 37-year-old Adrianne Terry had been standing behind Bernice Starnes, who was in a wheelchair due to a broken hip. Terry slowly walked around in front of her. Starnes later reported that she'd said good morning to the woman, who was nearly 50 years younger. In the moments that followed, Terry snatched her purse and said, "Now it is a good morning," before sprinting down the street. A witness reportedly heard the thief taunting the elderly woman about her inability to run after her as she fled. Terry, who'd made off with cash and the victim's bank card, was later captured on CCTV throwing a handbag in a trash bin nearby. She was eventually identified and arrested on larceny charges. Number 9. Billy Joe Martin. In January of 2023, Arizona man Billy Joe Martin was taken into custody by law enforcement in Miami, Florida, for punching and stabbing a gas store clerk over a can of beer. The incident took place at a gas station in the 500 block of Northwest 79th Street. Martin was confronted by the clerk after pocketing a beer from the fridge. He became aggressive, went into the glass-covered area where the worker was, and proceeded to repeatedly strike him with his fists and a knife. The attack was recorded by surveillance cameras, and the unnamed clerk fought back. 39-year-old Martin left the glass-covered area with a pack of cigarettes, at which point the worker locked himself in the enclosure and also locked the gas station doors before calling 911. Martin was trapped inside as law enforcement headed to the store. He refused to cooperate and was tasered by one of the responding officers before being taken into custody. The clerk was transported to a hospital with injuries to his head and torso, but was subsequently reported as being in stable condition. Martin continued behaving aggressively after his arrest, as he reportedly hit his head on the cruiser's plexiglass partition, spat on the officer, and launched a tirade of racial and ethnic slurs. He was charged with attempted murder, armed robbery, and battery on a law enforcement officer. Number 8. Sierra Zerbe. On June the 26th of 2022, a shoplifter was arrested on battery and child abuse charges after she'd pepper sprayed a family of 3 in Las Vegas. On June the 14th, an unnamed mother and her 2 children had entered a Burlington coat factory near Sahara and Hualapai. She heard shoplifting alarms going off and later on noticed that the suspect, Sierra Zerbe, was parked next to her car. An employee replied affirmatively when the woman asked if they wanted her to take a photo of the suspect's license plate. As she began to record, Zerbe repeatedly asked if she got a problem before deploying her pepper spray on the woman and her children. Zerbe then drove off, but her vehicle was subsequently located at an apartment complex near Maryland and Pyle. She was arrested and taken to the Clark County Detention Center. Number 7. Terry McMillan Jr. North Carolina man Terry McMillan Jr. was at a Home Depot in Hillsborough, North Carolina on October the 18th of 2022. McMillan tried to walk out of the store with 3 pressure washers valued at $837 in his shopping cart. He was then approached by an employee, 82-year-old Gary Rassel. The latter was described as favorite among those who visited the store, the majority of whom knew him as Mr. Gary. The store's CCTV captured an altercation during which McMillan violently pushed Rassel to the concrete floor before fleeing the store. The elderly man suffered multiple fractured bones and was left unable to walk. He was hospitalized for several weeks, a period during which he celebrated his 83rd birthday. Rassel eventually succumbed to complications stemming from his injuries and passed away on November the 30th. His wife reported that he'd been upbeat up until seeing the video of the attack, which is when he reportedly lost it. His condition then rapidly deteriorated. Rassel's wife shared the doctor's reports with a media outlet and claimed that the trauma had led to an acceleration of fibrosis. McMillan was arrested without incident by the Hillsborough Police Department and charged with first-degree murder and robbery. Updates from late January of 2023 indicated that the district attorney wasn't seeking the death penalty against McMillan, meaning that the maximum sentence he could face was life in prison without parole. Number 6. Tatsuma Hirao. Over 6,000 police officers were dispatched in April of 2018 on the small island of Mukaishima, Japan, after an inmate had escaped from a low-security prison in Ehime. 27-year-old Tatsuma Hirao was at the time serving a 5.5-year sentence for theft in a facility where inmates were free to walk around without walls or fences. He fled on April the 8th while working in the prison's shipbuilding yard. The wanted man embarked on a petty theft spree during his flight from justice. The items included socks, a mobile phone, a wallet, a pair of sandals, and a car. In the latter incident, Hirao left the owner a note that read, "I'm borrowing your car, but I'll never damage it." He drove the vehicle through the bridge and highway system that connected Ehime to neighboring islands before eventually reaching Mukashima. Law enforcement used thousands of officers, as well as dogs, drones, and helicopters, but in spite of the island only measuring 8.5 square miles, they were unable to locate Hirao. The hilly landscape obstructed aerial detection, and there were over 1,000 vacant holiday homes which the police couldn't enter without search warrants. Hirao was ultimately caught towards the end of April at a train station in Hiroshima, roughly 40 miles away. He reportedly told officers upon being taken back into custody that he'd swum to the mainland. Number 5. Michael Dunn. On October the 3rd of 2018, Cristobal Lopez, of no fixed address at the time, walked into a Vets Army Navy surplus in Lakeland, Florida. The store was managed by Lakeland City Commissioner Michael Dunn. CCTV would show the two men engaging in a physical altercation at the front door after 50-year-old Lopez had been caught shoplifting a hatchet. In the footage, Dunn pulled the petty thief back by his t-shirt as he struggled to get away while having a Glock handgun pointed at him the entire time. Dunn eventually shot the man twice in the torso. Lopez fell to the pavement outside the store, where he remained unattended for several minutes. He'd already died by the time that law enforcement arrived at the scene. The police determined that Dunn's actions fell outside Florida's stand your ground law, which allowed an individual to use deadly force if they were in imminent danger. The footage of the altercation didn't support that notion, and within a month of the fatal shooting, Dunn was indicted on charges of second-degree murder. His legal team argued that he'd shot Lopez out of fear that he was going to strike him with the hatchet. In March of 2021, Judge Donald Jacobson dismissed that argument and determined that there was clear and convincing evidence that deadly force was not justified at the time. Dunn eventually made a deal with the prosecution only a few days before jury selection for his trial was due to begin. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 3 years in prison, to be followed by 10 years of probation and 200 hours of community service. Number 4. Nathaniel Ferguson. When 49-year-old Nathaniel Ferguson was taken into custody by officers in Cleveland, Ohio in the winter of 2015, the South Euclid Police Department quipped that it was a moment worthy of inclusion into the Guinness Book of Records. The incident had marked the petty thief's 109th arrest. Since 1984, he'd given the police over 2,000 aliases, most of which were varied spellings of his name. At the time of his most recent arrest, he had 3 outstanding warrants with South Euclid Municipal Court and was wanted by multiple police departments. His 109th run-in with the law had involved Ferguson stealing an armful of teeth-whitening products from a CVS drugstore. He fled in a green Mercury and was later pulled over. He gave officers his brother's name upon being questioned, but given his criminal history, was eventually recognized. A search of his vehicle produced the stolen CVS items as well as 2 crack pipes. Ferguson was charged with theft, falsification, criminal trespass, and possession of drug paraphernalia. Number 3. James Pringle. A man who came to be known as New York City's most prolific criminal was denied bail for the first time in August of 2022. The NYPD quipped that James Pringle had amassed frequent flyer miles due to laws that offered bail only for serious offenses. The man had a staggering 167 arrests on his record, dwarfing the rap sheet of the offender closest behind him, who counted 101 arrests in New York City. Pringle's criminal past included 1 felony conviction, 88 misdemeanors, and 37 citations for failure to appear in court. The most recent incidents for which he'd gotten in trouble with the law included exposing himself at a CVS, swiping a tip jar from an 102nd Street cafe, and running after a person with a stick while yelling that he would kill them. When a judge finally required Pringle to make bail in February of 2022, they were quoted as saying, "It would take me all day to go through this rap sheet." 39-year-old Pringle's latest arrest occurred after he'd been caught stealing dozens of items worth an estimated $450 from a Rite Aid on the Upper East Side. The fact that he was denied bail during an August court appearance was notable, as it contrasted New York's recent reform laws that made it easier for repeat offenders to be bailed out. It was argued that Pringle would only appear in court following an arrest and had repeatedly failed at following the law even though he had been given every opportunity. Number 2. McKenna Finley. On November the 14th of 2022, Nevada woman McKenna Finley was captured on CCTV at a Walmart in southeast Las Vegas, carrying a silver revolver in her right hand as she was wheeling a cart with stolen items towards the exit. She was confronted by an unidentified 61-year-old worker, at which point Finley pointed a gun at them before firing a shot into the ceiling. She then left the store and loaded the pilfered items into the trunk of a Honda occupied by 2 men. One of them, the driver, was identified as Finley's boyfriend, Juan Cabrera. The couple had robbed local stores in similar fashion in the past. That same year, Cabrera and 21-year-old Finley had targeted another Walmart in North Las Vegas. The year before, in July, the young woman had pleaded guilty to assault after opening fire in a WSS shoe store while robbing it. Court records indicated that the duo were arrested and faced multiple charges in the most recent incident's aftermath, including robbery with the use of a deadly weapon, with the victim being an older person. In case you didn't watch our release about career criminals a while back, then you can stay tuned if you'd like. It's coming up right after this. Number 1. Joseph Harrell and Zynika Woods. Joseph Hirao, a teenager from Houston, Texas, was caught on surveillance cameras on February the 13th of 2023, brutally assaulting a woman during an attempt to snatch her purse. He'd followed mother of 3, Nong Trong, for several miles from a shopping center after he'd spotted her withdrawing cash from a bank. Trong had planned to use the money, which amounted to $4,600, for an upcoming trip to Vietnam. Upon reaching Chinatown, in an area that was hidden from public view, Harrell charged the 44-year-old. She fell to the ground in the altercation and dropped several items, including the cash, a cell phone, and her purse. Harrell swiped the bag while Trung took the cash and tried to run away. The teenager then grabbed the woman from behind, lifted her, and body slammed her into the pavement. He then fled in a car driven by his accomplice, 19-year-old Zynika Woods. Trung was left paralyzed from the waist down after suffering a fractured spine and other severe injuries. She subsequently started a GoFundMe, which as of late March of 2023 had drawn in over $310,000 in donations. Harrell was out on bond for an unrelated weapons charge at the time of the attack on Trung. Just over a week later, he and another suspect allegedly stole a woman's purse in southeast Houston. The victim and her husband were able to track him down via AirPods that were in the bag. They then called 911, and as they waited for the authorities, Harrell allegedly confronted the victim and threatened her with a handgun. He was arrested, and the police subsequently connected him to the attack on Trung as well. They'd managed to find surveillance footage of the vehicle that Harrell and Woods had used in the violent robbery. Woods was subsequently detained for a traffic violation, and upon being questioned by detectives, confessed to the Trung robbery, implicating Harrell as well. They were both charged with robbery, while Harrell was also charged with aggravated assault. While in custody, he confessed to the crime in a profanity-laden jailhouse phone call. Harrell was recorded saying, "I hopped out, snatched the purse, the lady ran with the money, I grabbed her, slammed her, and she was paralyzed." He laughed at the prospect of facing 20 years in prison and at the fact that the lady probably wants justice, but while griping about her GoFundMe, added that she better run on with her life. Number 7. Matthew Joseph Medlin. On May the 12th of 2020, a 36-year-old man broke into a snack shack at a railway station in Portland, Oregon. The suspect, later identified as career criminal Matthew Joseph Medlin, was spotted by members of transit police, who immediately gave chase. Medlin fled into a nearby supermarket and hid himself in the stockroom, but was eventually tracked down and confronted by law enforcement. The man then concealed his hands underneath his jacket and threatened to shoot the officers, who ultimately neutralized him by firing their tasers at him. They subsequently brought the suspect into custody, whereupon they discovered that he hadn't in fact had a weapon in his possession at the time of the break-in, charged with burglary, criminal mischief, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest. Medlin was booked into the Multnomah County Detention Center on a $16,500 bond. In the incident's aftermath, a series of mugshots from Medlin's past arrests surfaced online, with many commenting on the gradual devolution of his physical appearance as he added tattoos and other markings to his face over time. Medlin's initial arrest reportedly occurred on his 18th birthday in 2002. At that time, he had no tattoos and was perceived as a normal-looking person in stark contrast to his menacing appearance in his 2020 mugshot. Number 6. Dwayne Adrian Johnson. At about 5:30 p.m. on Christmas Day 2016, Washington, D.C. actress Trisha McCauley, who most notably appeared in the 2006 dance drama Step Up, got into her two-door Toyota Scion to drive to a holiday party being held at a friend's house in the city. When the 46-year-old never showed up to the party, she was eventually reported missing, and the Metropolitan Police Department promptly set a widespread search effort into motion. Then shortly after 11 p.m. the following night, investigators found McCauley's car parked outside of a pharmacy. Upon entering the store, officers encountered 30-year-old career criminal Dwayne Adrian Johnson, who reportedly had the key to McCauley's vehicle in his pocket. The car was subsequently searched, at which point the actress's lifeless body was found in the back seat. Johnson, who also had the victim's credit cards in his possession, was arrested on suspicion of committing her murder. During the ensuing police investigation, it emerged that Johnson had forced his way into McCauley's car while she was driving to her friend's Christmas party. He then proceeded to assault the woman, after which the two became engaged in a physical struggle that resulted in her clothing being ripped and her nose fracturing. Johnson ultimately took the scarf McCauley had been wearing and used it to fatally strangle her. In September of 2017, the man pleaded guilty to first-degree felony murder, and he was consequently sentenced to a prison term of 30 years, which was ordered to be followed by 30 years of supervised release. Number 5. Tyrell Rollins. On April the 23rd of 2020, a vehicle driven by Tyrell Rollins was pulled over by the police in Plant City, Florida, for having excessively dark tint on its windows. 27-year-old Rollins subsequently fled the traffic stop, reportedly reaching speeds of up to 93 miles per hour as he attempted to escape through the nearby neighborhood. Although officers initially chased after the suspect, they ultimately called off their pursuit because of his erratic driving. Shortly thereafter, Rollins ran through a stop sign at a dangerously high velocity and plowed into a car being driven by 53-year-old Amanda Renee Holmes Williams. The latter, a Plant City grandmother who'd been going about her everyday life when the crash occurred, was reportedly killed on impact. Rollins ran from the scene of the accident without stopping to render aid to the victim. He was found hiding in the backyard of a nearby house later that day, and he was then taken into custody on a myriad of charges, including third-degree murder, fleeing and attempting to elude a police officer, and vehicular homicide. In February of 2022, Rollins was found guilty on each of the charges levied against him, resulting in a sentence of 30 years behind bars. It marked the third time he'd been sent to prison during his career as a criminal. Prison records indicated that Rollins had been incarcerated for aggravated battery and other offenses between March of 2015 and August of 2018. Number 4. Olivio DeLeona. Career criminal Olivio DeLeona was released from Massachusetts State Prison in early March of 2018 after serving as a cooperating witness for Plymouth County District Attorney Timothy Cruz. Then in October of that same year, the 31-year-old man became the target of surveillance by Brockton police, who'd received a tip that he was planning an armed home invasion along with 2 accomplices. At about 8:30 p.m. on October the 22nd, officers began watching a black BMW driven by Leverone. They eventually conducted a motor vehicle stop, whereupon they found items stolen from a house that had been burglarized earlier that evening inside of Leverone's car. The latter and his accomplices were arrested on charges of receiving stolen property, to which they each pleaded not guilty during their arraignments the following day. Leverone resurfaced on the radar of New England law enforcement in February of 2021 when it was reported that he'd been involved in a deadly shooting outside of a car wash in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. The victim, named as Julius Bell, was found suffering from a critical gunshot wound to the head. He was rushed to a nearby hospital where he was ultimately pronounced dead a short time later. A preliminary investigation into the matter uncovered that the shooting had been precipitated by an argument between multiple people, although initial reports didn't specify whether Bell had been involved or had only been a bystander. Leverone faced several additional charges in connection to the incident, including murder, conspiracy to commit assault with a dangerous weapon, discharging a firearm during a violent crime, and conspiracy to carry a pistol without a license. As of the latest available updates, the career criminal was still awaiting the commencement of his case's legal proceedings. Number 3. Deshore Early. Shortly after 10 p.m. on April the 21st of 2017, a police officer was dispatched to a parking garage overlooking the Florida State University Collegetown apartment complex at 815 West Madison Street in Tallahassee. Upon his arrival, the officer reportedly found a male suspect performing lewd acts on himself near the garage's north guard wall. The man was ordered to put his hands up, but instead began walking away from the officer before urinating on the ground in between two parked vehicles. Upon his subsequent arrest, the suspect, identified as Deshore Early, told the police that he'd gone to the garage to urinate because all of the nearby businesses had already closed for the night. In the wake of the incident, it was reported that while Early had been performing the lascivious acts at the garage, he'd been peering through the open window of a neighboring apartment, in which he could see a woman changing clothes. Early was consequently taken to Leon County Jail on charges of voyeurism and indecent exposure. The 34-year-old man's criminal history reportedly went back to the year 2000, when he was arrested in connection to armed burglary and kidnapping charges. Number 2. Alan Jett. The police in Cranston, Rhode Island, received reports of a series of break-ins at local businesses committed during the nighttime hours between January the 10th and January the 17th of 2022. According to subsequent reports, investigators quickly determined that the burglaries had been carried out by a single male suspect who would approach the businesses on a bicycle before gaining entry by smashing through their glass storefronts. After pilfering money from the cash registers, the man would flee back to his nearby residence prior to the arrival of police. Detectives ultimately identified the alleged thief as 64-year-old Alan Jett, a local resident with a lengthy criminal track record dating all the way back to 1979. The Cranston Police Department executed a search warrant of Jett's home, where they seized evidence linking him to a total of 6 break-ins. During their sweep of the residence, Jett reportedly became uncooperative and struck an officer in the face, at which point he was taken into custody. He faced several charges, including multiple counts of breaking and entering a business with the intent to commit a felony, as well as simple assault on a police detective. Prior to his 2022 arrest, Jett had most recently spent time in Rhode Island's adult correctional institutions after pleading no contest to charges of felony breaking and entering in May of 2005. Number 1. Assamad Nash. New York City resident Christina Una Lee returned to her 6th-floor apartment on Christie Street in Chinatown in the early morning hours of February the 13th of 2022. As was captured by the building surveillance cameras, the 35-year-old woman, a creative producer for the online music platform Splice, was followed inside by a hooded man wearing a gray sweatshirt. Minutes later, a neighbor contacted the authorities after hearing Lee repeatedly shriek, "Help me! Call 911!" NYPD officers responded to the scene and came upon the suspect, Assamad Nash, covered in blood. The 25-year-old man, later identified as a homeless career criminal, allegedly tried to flee by way of the fire escape before barricading himself in the apartment. The NYPD's emergency service unit ultimately forced their way inside, at which point they found Nash hiding under a bed. Officers also discovered a bloody knife that was determined to have been used to brutally attack Lee, who was found in her bathtub, bleeding from multiple wounds to the body. The homeowner was ultimately pronounced dead shortly before 6 a.m., roughly an hour and a half after she'd been first accosted by Nash, who was taken into custody on murder charges. It subsequently emerged that he had an extensive criminal rap sheet dating back to 2012 that included arrests for petty crimes and robbery, the latter of which investigators believe to have been the primary motive behind the deadly home invasion. Nash was reportedly scheduled to appear in court on July the 18th of 2022. Thanks for watching. Would you rather spend a month in a low-security prison or a week in Supermax? Let us know in the comments section below.